My name is Maciej Jagielak. I come here from Polish Natural Building Association, which is similar organization to ASBN, although we don't only deal with straw bale building, but with a wider topic of building healthy, natural, ecological houses. And I would like to talk to you about an honest approach to ecological architecture. I nicknamed that No Greenwash Green Architecture. And I would like to start with emphasis on sustainability as something interesting. I'm honestly convinced that sustainability, ecology are not boring topics, are not something, those words are commonly abused and used to sell products or used to make policies, and this is not higher? Where? I need to be there to be filmed, yeah? Okay. And now I have light in my eyes, and I have to answer all the questions truly without blinking. Okay, so there is a big mess in this vocabulary, and quite a lot of this vocabulary is used without much meaning or understanding the meaning. And it is crucial that we understand what we are talking about, because as I said, it's an interesting topic, and it's interesting because it has a direct meaning, a direct connection to our own lives, into my life, to your life, to your children's life, and for the future generations as well. So, let's start with ecology. Well, what is green? When we say green, we usually think about ecology or sustainability or both, or we just think about the color in which the doors are painted here. So, ecology. The term ecology was first coined and phrased in the way it's written in this slide by one of those, 19th century era scientists who were doing real science, like running around tropical islands with a net catching butterflies, and he coined this term. Ecology, which was used to describe a relation between organism and its environment. So if we try to apply that to architecture, it's not the same use of the word that we use today. When we talk about ecological architecture, we don't, or more or less ecological building technologies, we are not talking directly about this. We are most likely talking about sustainable architecture or ecological architecture in a way that this is an architecture which fulfills or helps us to reach the goals of sustainable development. And sustainable development is something which is pretty well defined, and you can find the most often quoted definition here. So it's supposed to be development which will make our planet work for longer, or maybe even forever, and will supply and will meet the needs of future generations of both humans and other organisms. And what is important to know about sustainable development, that it is a compromise. And as every compromise, it's not perfect. It was a compromise between people who said there is no more growth possible in a traditional sense, and between people who wanted to have development in this, well, business as usual, just create more stuff, produce more stuff, sell more things, and have more money circulation. So it's a compromise, and as every compromise, it's the best thing, I guess it's the best thing we have for now, like a common idea, but you need to understand that it might be this term might be used with in a different context in different ways, and it might be more eco-centric, or it can be more people-centric, or it might even be, you know, greenwash. Greenwash is a word which is used to describe a kind of lie, or at least a misdirection of attention, which is, and it's a commonly used strategy in selling products by labeling them green, or by just having one green feature in them. And this bottle of water here is just an example, you know. The advertisement says that this bottle contains less plastic. And okay, it may be good for environment that it is slightly lighter bottle, but for me it's greenwash, because in fact it's the mineral water in bottle which is a problem, which is causing a lot of trouble globally, because it is in a plastic bottle. And I think a solution, a real sustainable solution, is to go without mineral water in plastic bottles, at least on everyday basis. So I've talked a little bit about sustainability and tried to apply that to architecture. So I told you that architecture, at least to me, ecological architecture is that kind of architecture that supports sustainable growth and is created with respect to our planet. But the question is, can we measure like how sustainable a thing like a building or an action like creating a building is? There are several tools for that, and the most popular tools are carbon footprint calculations, in which we check how much carbon dioxide or other gases is produced in the process. And another interesting calculation tool is ecological footprint. With this footprint, scientists try to check how much land is needed to supply everything we need for, let's say, a building process, or for our lifestyle, or for a city, or for a country. And what is interesting is that it's a very difficult thing to calculate, very difficult number to arrive at, because our footprint is spread all over the world. And this ecological footprint is expressed in area of land which takes to support our actions. So let's say we want to produce food, we need a central area of land to grow that food, but we also need a central area of land for the agriculture, to get metals to produce our tractors. So this is all calculated into the footprint of our food, for instance. So it's a very difficult calculation. It is, let's say, it's not a very precise number what they are arriving at. This is a kind of the best estimation. But these calculations that have been done so far show that we are already living far above the carrying capacity of our planet. So we are using more of Earth area, well, we cannot be using more than there is, but we are using more of it than it is possible to regenerate. So we are putting a strain on the ecosystems. And when we have those calculations and the results of those calculations, we can try to apply the results by calculating what should our footprint be to stay within this bearing capacity of Earth. And from carbon footprint calculations, we could, and it is applied that way, but we can try to limit our carbon emissions to kind of slow down the global warming process. So what is ecological architecture? I've asked myself again, and because I was still not sure, I Googled it. And this was the result. This search was conducted in Polish, but probably it would be something similar in other languages. So green architecture green projects are usually projects where architects put a lot of green facades, green roofs, or maybe just painted green, and they put a lot of wind turbines on it. Wind turbines, or sometimes they even make things floating on the ocean. But what happens in real life and what is sold like to an average customer, it's not this ecological architecture, this vision of like aesthetical vision of ecological architecture. What is being marketed the most and what is already obligatory to everyone living in Europe, it's ecological building, which does not take the whole extent of ecology into account, but which means energy efficiency. So we are supposed to build houses which are very energy efficient. And I have to say, this is an approach which is, for me, not good enough. It's not something which solves the problem at the first place, and it's not, I mean, like, it's not an idea you can fall in love with, you know? It's not an idea you can make, or at least I cannot imagine, you know, being at my life quest to be building houses with, you know, the least possible energy use per square meter. No, it's not my mission. It does not move my imagination enough. What does move my imagination enough to dedicate my work to making better ecological, truly green architecture is a positive vision of how can we change our world, our architecture, our lifestyles into something good. No longer to be ashamed that we produce that much carbon and that much rubbish or that much waste. And the only like really convincing vision of how to do it in a positive way, I found in a book which is called Cradle to Cradle, and which explains that this problem that we are facing can be seen as a design problem, and that we can try to redesign all the processes in our civilization. Industrial processes are like the most important in this maybe, but also our lives, our architecture, everything to be cradle to cradle. So to get rid of this philosophy that we take something from Earth, we change it into some products in the industrial process, and then we throw the leftovers away. We need to change it in such a way that every material circulates in our economy or in our industry in the way it does in nature. This is very convincing, but it is extremely hard to do, and it's probably not going to be, the solutions are not going to be there in our lifetime. So as an architect, for me, it is the most important motivation to go for natural materials. Because for natural materials, I mean unprocessed local materials which either come from earth or are grown like trees or straw. For them, we do not to design the cycle, because the cycle is already there. It's the natural cycle of nutrients in nature. And what is also very convincing for me to choose natural materials is that they help to bring in this community feeling, this idea of building with your own hands, with experiencing the building site, which is crucial if the owners of the houses are to identify with their houses. And I would also like to stress that we have already something to base on. We don't have to reinvent this wheel of natural building, because the knowledge which is maybe not written down but still remembered by those buildings from the past is there. So we have a tradition of building with local materials from which we can benefit by learning or by continuing it in a creative way. All right, now I need a pause, and I need somebody to tell me how much time do I have left. Because finished this important but not very picturesque part, which was the introduction, and now 20 minutes. Very good. So I can continue through my most favorite part of this presentation, which is a selection of 3 out of my favorite designers and people whose life and ideas could be an inspiration on how to think about ecological architecture, how to try to implement some real change in the world by the work we do as designers, builders, and so on. One of them is Hassan Fatih, who is an Egyptian who is educated in more or less the same way as European architects were educated at that time. So this were he worked mostly in the first part of 20th century and also into the second part of second half of 20th century, and he was educated in the times where modernism in its kind of pioneering, glorious phase was the deal of the day. It was the kind of architecture which was supposed to change the world. And Fatih, after finishing his school, had this experience of going to one of his father's estates in the countryside and seeing the conditions in which Egyptian peasants lived there. And this were, that was a cultural shock for him. And he dedicated his early career into improving these conditions. And he knew that for this particular application, modernism, meaning efficient concrete construction, was no way to go, because those peasants were so poor that they could not afford reed mats for the roofs of their houses. So they could not ever possibly afford rebar and steel and concrete, which was a new material then and was not even common for public buildings in Egypt. It was no way they could build sustainable. Well, they didn't use the word, but they could build for affordable houses for peasants with concrete. And he proposed to revive certain building technologies which came from the past, so basically building with clay and mixtures of clay and sand and so on. And these are some samples of his projects. So this is architecture coming from 20th century, which incorporates tradition both in form and certain strategies like wind catchers, for instance, for natural cooling. And what was a big discovery which he needed to make in order to be able to do this affordable architecture, he needed to avoid building with wood, which was also not affordable for the peasants, and to discover ways which were simple enough for the farmers so they could build it themselves. So he knew already that in ancient times Egyptians were able to build arches from unburnt clay brick, and when those arches survived under cover of sand, of course, but survived for thousands of years. And he started to experiment with building those arches, but he couldn't get it right. So fortunately, he found that in some other parts of Egypt, namely in Nubia, there were still some masons who were still building that way. And he found those masons. This is one of those master masons. And they taught him how to build arches from unburnt clay brick without scaffolding. And that was a revolutionary step for him, because from that on he could propose building with basically one material, which is unburnt clay brick, without practically any wooden scaffolding, without practically any expense for tools. So he could propose that the peasants could build houses for themselves, just using the material which was freely available under their feet. And as I said, he also implemented some natural cooling strategies into his designs, which were, again, not a new thing. They were reinterpretation of what was already there in the traditional Egyptian architecture. This is a wind catcher, which which catches the breeze, redirects it into a courtyard, and later, after going through the courtyard in the house, this warm and less clean air is going out through a kind of cupola which provides natural ventilation. There are other strategies like having two courtyards, with which one of them is full of plants and the other one is hard and warmer, so there's a natural draft going through the house, and so on and so on. And one more thing which I want to tell you about Fatih is his attitude to tradition. The tradition for Fatih was not a limiting factor. For him, it was a framework from which every artist could start his work, and not to reinvent architecture or painting or sculpture every time he or she starts designing or creating art. With tradition, they could start from tradition, and from that framework create something even better. And another interesting thought on tradition is that in his he was famous for doing, this is a plan for a new development, like a whole new village which he designed. And in those designs, he did two things which were, for me, absolutely revolutionary. One thing was to oppose modern movement in that way that he did not accept the fact there is something like an average need of our inhabitants. He wanted to design the houses, although it was like a whole new settlement. He wanted to design houses for families with consultation, with individual traces, for an individual approach for every single house. And this is something which didn't fit in the modernist ideas of that time. And another thing was that he refused to and opposed an idea of connecting running water to every house, which would also be like the most obvious choice for any European architects of that time, because it would be like the modern way of doing things. He said no, because at that time in Egypt, like going to the well and carrying water back was an extremely important cultural tradition. It was practically the most important way of a young girl to meet her future husband. This was the only way, the only like official moment when the girls were allowed to go somewhere, kind of by walking to the well and taking this water back, presenting themselves to their future husband. This was the moment of meeting. So by creating, like having tap water in the house, you would have to change the whole culture which was linked to that. You would, instead of this, you would have to propose along the tap water. You would also have to propose major changes in the lifestyle. So it was a kind of cultural sensibility and tradition treated as a way to preserve kind of cultural diversity there. Another one of my design heroes is Malcolm Wells, who is another person who had a kind of sudden change in his career. Namely, he was quite a successful architect for about 10 years. Then, at the peak of his career, he built this pavilion for a world fair, and suddenly he had some enlightening moment there, looking at this pavilion, that this is all waste. This is going to be demolished after the fair. This is a tremendous, although it's a nice building, it's a tremendous waste of resource. And he summed it up like this, that as an architect, he was taking part in this process, this taking of resources and producing something and then dumping something away. There is no away, as you all know. There is no away for our rubbish, for our waste. We are all living in the same planet. So after he had this moment of insight, at least what his books say, he came back home and told his co-workers that from that day on, they are only going to do buildings which are going to be covered with earth and as gentle for the environment as possible. Obviously, after 2 years or so, he needed to reduce from 10-man architectural practice to being alone and having no commissions, because it was a thought which was much forward of his times. And instead, when he had no commissions, he started to draw and write his beautiful handwritten books. And those books made him popular. Like this little book, which is shown here, which was the most successful of his books. He wrote it and drawn all the illustrations himself, and he sent it by post on order, and he sold 100,000 copies. And actually, he recovered from the financial crisis by writing a kind of like visionary texts and visionary drawings, like how could the architecture future look like? He concluded that it's not only about green roofs, it's about like leaving some place on Earth for other species, for plants, for animals. And what I've learned from his books, I think it's like the most still kind of important lessons for architects, but the best site for a building is not a beautiful place somewhere by the forest and the river. 5 minutes, yeah. The best site for a building is a derelict site, a brown site, which by act of building, you can transform into a place of life. And another lesson from Malcolm Welm's books is a kind of rating system, which is probably the most early rating system for buildings there is, or at least the earliest one I know, and which is very simple. What he did was to compare a building or a neighborhood or a city to the, like ideal wild nature, so an ideal ecosystem. In the ecosystem, an ecosystem, so this wild nature provides space for life, not for one species, for many. It actually stores water, it purifies water, it purifies air, it does numerous services to sustain life of not only people, but also other species. And if you rate a building according to those lines, he had a simple system. The question was whether it gives life or it takes from life. And a typical building would be usually on the taking side. It will not supply life of different species. It will not store rainwater. It will not purify air. On the contrary, it will do damage to the surroundings. So he tried to work against this criteria and try to find best solutions. These are his realized buildings, but in fact, what he realized was much less important to his writings, because we remember him and he's widely known because of his books, not the realized buildings, which is also an important message for architects, that maybe sometimes not building is also important. Another person who I would like to introduce is Ianto Evans from Cobb Cottage Company. Cobb is building with clay in a very natural way by just combining it with sand and some straw and by hand and with tools sculpting it together. There is quite a lot of traditional Cobb architecture, for instance, in United Kingdom, but I'm not going to talk about material itself, but the way of thinking which is possible with this material is to shape the buildings like clothes. It's a very refreshing thought that that maybe with the right material we do not need to design our buildings like this in rectangulars. This is another example. Like a typical way to do for an architect is to create a kind of bubble diagrams, of functions, later turn them into boxes and stack those boxes together to have a box which is a house. He proposed, okay, you can make bubble diagrams of things going around the house, but why should you turn it into boxes if you have a sculptural material like Cobb? And although I'm not sure if Cobb is the material of the future, this kind of thinking might be applied to maybe to future materials which might become available, and I think it will create a big difference in the way we make buildings. Another interesting observations from this book by Cobb Cottage Company is that you could be, if you build very small, you can build on your own and you can live without a loan, which is a very good thought, because like most of us nowadays, maybe not most of us, but the typical way to build a house in my country is first to gain a loan, which is like a 30-year slavery, and then for the 30 years you have a house which you are actually renting from your bank, because if your leg slips, you don't have work for some time, you lose your house. So basically, it might be a refreshing thought to build smaller and without credit. And importance of this sculpturality of Cobb and this strategy to sculpt a house around it is that with a very limited space, you can create a kind of spaciousness which is not available in a house designed like a box. Okay, that's it. And now I have a conclusion for you. So, no greenwash green architecture, or really green architecture, or truly ecological architecture, no matter what you call it, is a kind of ideal which I would like to see realized in real world. And we have several tools or allies which can help us to achieve this. They are listed here, and it's a kind of very condensed list about which I could talk for hours, but there is no place for that. But a basic assumption that I have is that to proceed with this mission of ecological architecture, the basic thing we need to start with is honesty of intention, that we really need to think that we have something to change and we want to change it. Thank you for listening.